Think about it. A story can start anytime, any day, in any way. And this particular story started in September 1999 during a hurricane. That's when this little guy named Colin was born. Colin had his own way of doing things, of seeing the world around him, thinking outside the box to make things work, a sense of humor that many times drove his teachers crazy. February 8th, 2014 was a really great day. We spent it skiing and snowboarding, but what we didn't know is that cancer was starting to grow in Colin's body. Every person has a factory that's in their bone marrow, and every second of every day, the bone marrow is making cells. What we didn't understand is that in Colin's bone marrow factory, instead of making healthy white blood cells, it was making cancer cells. So in the span of just 10 days, Colin went from a soccer-loving, hard-working 8th grader that had just thankfully finished his science fair project a couple months earlier into a really sick 14-year-old that was only a few days away from dying. Colin had to start chemotherapy right away. He had a really aggressive cancer called Burkitt's leukemia. And right away, the bad cells started to fight the good cells. Colin's hair was going to fall out, so instead of waiting for it to do that, we went ahead and shaved his head. Colin had friends that came down and got their heads shaved too, so he didn't feel so alone. Colin's cancer surrounded him in his central nervous system, so a couple times a week he would have to go to sedation so that they could inject the chemotherapy directly into his spinal fluid. It was really hard on Colin. He ended up losing 40 pounds and wasn't able to walk anymore. One of the parts that Colin hated the most was always having to be alone, not being allowed to be in school and see his friends. You can look out the window at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and I know he always felt like he was in jail. Even with cancer, you don't get to stop going to school. You just have to figure a different way out to do it, and Colin joined a lot of his classes through Google Hangouts. The times that Colin did get to go home and hang out with his friends were incredibly important to him. Colin was even included in the 8th grade day of service when the kids made bagged lunches for the oncology families over at the Ronald McDonald House. In September, Colin started 9th grade, and I got to give him his last shot of chemotherapy in late September. It was a pretty big deal. We went out and celebrated. Things started to go back to normal, and we were living life like Colin had beat cancer. Colin still went to CHOP every month to get his blood tested to make sure everything looked okay. And it was a really big day when Colin was able to get his first haircut. This picture is like the quiet before the storm to me. We were out walking along the Wissahickon enjoying the day, but had no idea what was starting to happen in Colin's body. On April 8th, 2015, we were a couple days away from learning that Colin was getting a second cancer caused by some of the medicine we gave him to beat his first cancer. To figure out what kind of cancer Colin had the second time, he had to go to sleep, and they drilled into his hip bone to take out some of that marrow from that factory and look at it under a microscope. And it confirmed that cancer was back again. So Colin had to start all the chemotherapies back up, this time for a cancer worse than the first one called acute myeloid leukemia. So you guessed it, he had to get his head shaved again. And he started the same uphill climb of having to get better. What made it harder is that Colin was often trapped in that hospital room for 30 and 40 days at a time, and he wasn't allowed to leave. And remember, school doesn't stop for chemotherapy. The thing is, it's really hard being a teenager in a hospital that was made for little kids. It was a pretty big deal when Colin finally got to go home. The thing is, Colin looked really great on the outside. But on the inside, all the chemotherapies that Colin got for 2 cancers and a bone marrow transplant really wrecked his organs and his immune system. So they ran a lot of blood tests to take a look at those cells again. And what they learned through all the blood work is that Colin's bone marrow factory wasn't making all the cells it needed to make. Colin's body wasn't making something called killer T cells. Think about it this way. Colin's body had the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army, but the Marines never showed up. And you can't win a war in your immune system if you don't have all 4 branches working. Colin was working really hard, as was Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, to figure out what was going on. So we even went to Texas and Boston to see what they had to say. But Colin's lungs kept getting sicker. Colin was in and out of the hospital a lot, and he was taking a whole lot of medicine every day. Colin's doctors were starting to get worried. We were getting really worried too. Everything really was stacked against Colin, but he kept accepting help and he kept trying to get better. The thing about Colin and his story is that even though every day had something bad for him, he also realized every day also had something good, and that connected with a lot of people. Colin's strength of determination even caught the eye of the Eagles, where the NFL gave him a 1-day contract to be a player. Colin stayed friends with the Eagles, and we found ourselves on a private airplane a few years later with tickets to the Super Bowl. And the amazing thing is, the person that provided the airplane to us, since Colin couldn't fly on a commercial airline, we had no idea who they were. They just did it, being kind. Our last time spent together as a family was at the Super Bowl, and this was all because somebody decided to reach out and help us. And that kindness, it was pretty amazing. On March 24th, 2018, Colin went into the hospital for the last time. Colin stuck with studying and his schoolwork, and he even wrote the end of his own story. On April 19th, with 5 infections that his body couldn't fight and the lungs that had failed, Colin asked for me and his dad and his medical team to take the vent out, and he died that evening at 11 p.m. Remarkably, Colin kept up with his schoolwork from 8th grade all the way through 12th grade, and he was a part of the graduating class of 2018, and his brother, Will, accepted his diploma on his behalf and in his honor. Colin connected with many people, and Colin Strong stood for many things. It meant being strong enough to ask for help, being strong enough to be the author of your own story, and being strong enough to recognize that even when things are bad, you look for something good within them. Like I said, a story can start any time in any place, and I think Colin's story is far from over. Oh, and by the way, that music that's been playing during this video, Colin wrote that, together with Mike from Music Therapy, all those days, over 350 of them, that he was inpatient at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Pretty awesome. Think about it. What is your story going to be?